At 11:47 yesterday, a line buried inside Canada's trade messaging turned into a very loud signal to Washington. Canada is done chasing piecemeal, made-for-TV deals with the Trump White House, and Ottawa is willing to let the side talks die if the price is humiliation, permanent tariffs, or a rewrite of Canadian sovereignty in exchange for temporary relief. In competitor script language, this is the moment Canada walks away, not because Canada is slamming the door on diplomacy, but because Canada is refusing the kind of deal Trump wants most, the quick, public, pressure-tested handshake that turns Canada's economy into a hostage. And if you've watched this relationship over the last year, you already know what comes next. Trump fires back. He always fires back, sometimes with tariffs, sometimes with threats, sometimes by terminating negotiations on social media, sometimes by changing the deadline, then changing it again, then turning the uncertainty itself into the weapon. So tonight on Dylan Sterling Analysis, I'm Dylan Sterling, and I'm going to walk you through the exact mechanics of what Canada walking away really means in 2026, why it's happening now, why the USMCA review clock is the real battlefield, and why Trump's response isn't just political drama, it's strategy, and there is a clock running, not 72 hours. The real clock is July 1st, 2026, the scheduled joint review of the USMCA, and the quiet but brutal sunset structure behind it that can turn North America into a decade-long annual hostage negotiation if one party wants uncertainty more than it wants stability. Now let's start with the breaking part. What changed? This week, Canada's minister responsible for Canada-US trade, Dominic LeBlanc, warned that if there's no consensus at the USMCA review, the agreement continues, but then annual reviews begin, and uncertainty could become the objective. He also said that uncertainty is already chilling investment in Canada, net business investment down, companies pausing decisions because nobody knows what the rules will be next quarter, let alone next year. That is the real economic cost of this trade war, not just tariffs, but paralysis. That warning is not a random remark. It's a signal that Canada is shifting from please stop to we are preparing for the long game. Because the most important thing LeBlanc said wasn't just the annual review risk, it was that he's heading to Washington to meet U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer ahead of the July review. That tells you Ottawa is treating the review process, not side deals, not handshake diplomacy, not public bargaining, as the arena where this gets settled. And that is where the Canada walks away framing becomes real. Because for months Canada has been stuck in this loop, sector tariff here, exemption there, deadline here, sudden cancellation there. LeBlanc even said Canada felt it was close to a sectoral tariff deal in the fall, before Trump abruptly ended talks in response to an anti-tariff TV ad produced by Ontario. That we were close, and then he blew it up. Pattern is why Canada is changing posture. Let's rewind, because the timeline matters enormously. October 24, 2025, Trump publicly said he had terminated all trade negotiations with Canada, explicitly tying it to Ontario's anti-tariff ad that used Ronald Reagan audio. That wasn't a policy memo, it was a social post, but it demonstrated the core problem Canada has been trying to solve ever since. You can't negotiate stable trade rules with someone who treats negotiations as a live-fire loyalty test. Then, as the relationship stayed tense, the threats kept evolving. Trump threatened massive tariffs at points floating 35% on Canadian goods, tying it to grievances like fentanyl and trade deficits, and openly warning Canada not to raise its own tariffs, or he would stack punishment on top. Whether each threatened number becomes policy is almost secondary. The repeated message is the point. Access to the US market is conditional, and the conditions are political. And in January 2026, as Canada pursued a narrow trade arrangement with China, Trump threatened a 100% tariff on goods imported from Canada over that China deal, again framing Canada as a potential conduit. At that moment, Carney called Trump's threats bluster, and LeBlanc framed Canada's China move as narrow and sector-limited, not a comprehensive realignment. The details matter here because the US reaction wasn't just about trade, it was about control of the North American perimeter. Now layer in the part most people miss. The USMCA review structure is designed to create leverage. USTR has been publicly preparing for the July 1, 2026 joint review, including seeking public comment in advance, Brookings and multiple policy analyses explain the sunset mechanism. USMCA runs for an initial 16-year term to July 1, 2036, but at the first joint review in 2026, the parties must confirm whether they wish to extend. If they do not all confirm extension, then joint reviews occur annually until the agreement expires in 2036, meaning you can create a decade of recurring uncertainty without formally ending the agreement. That is a feature that can be weaponized. So when Canada says it is no longer chasing side deals and will instead fold the fights into the review process, that is not giving up. That is Canada saying, we refuse to negotiate under a permanent threat cloud with no structure. We will negotiate under the structure that exists, even if that structure is itself risky. Now, what does Canada walks away from US trade deals actually mean in practice? It does not mean Canada stops trading with the US tomorrow. It does not mean the border closes. It does not mean Canada tears up USMCA. It means Canada is stepping back from the idea of a near-term grand bargain or a set of quick sector deals, steel, aluminum, autos, lumber, where the US offers temporary relief and Canada offers permanent concessions. And there is a reason this shift is happening now. Canada is trying to remove Trump's favorite tool, the stage. Carney's posture over the last year has repeatedly pointed to the same principle. Canada will talk, but not as theatre, not as public bargaining, not as a daily humiliation ritual, where one Truth Social post can detonate months of technical progress. And you can see Canadian officials explicitly steering the conversation toward the review, rather than ad hoc deal-making. Now let's talk about the Trump side, because competitor scripts often reduce everything to Trump mad. But the pattern is more disciplined than that. Trump's approach uses 3 leverage layers. Layer 1, baseline tariffs and sector tariffs that can be escalated. Layer 2, unpredictable deadlines, terminations and resumptions, uncertainty as pressure. Layer 3, reframing the fight as existential fentanyl, sovereignty, 51st state rhetoric so that trade becomes identity politics. And each time Canada resists, Trump fires back with a different layer depending on what hurts most. When Canada pursued the digital services tax, Trump suspended talks. Canada rescinded the tax and talks resumed. That is the template. Apply pain, force retreat, declare victory. When Ontario ran the Reagan anti-tariff ad, Trump terminated negotiations outright, showing Canada that even provincial messaging can become a national punishment trigger. When Canada moved toward a China deal, Trump threatened 100% tariffs, showing Canada that its diversification strategy itself could be treated as provocation. So if Canada now walks away from US trade deals, meaning it stops chasing short-term relief and shifts to long-horizon structure, Trump's incentive is to punish that choice, so that Canada learns a lesson. You don't get to opt out of my timeline. That is why you should expect the fireback. Now, I want to be precise here. Fireback doesn't necessarily mean a single new tariff announcement today. It means the continuation of a proven pattern, threats, leverage, and a demand that Canada negotiate under US terms. And the reason it matters is that Canada's new posture is a direct attack on Trump's best weapon, speed. Canada is trying to slow the battlefield down to the treaty calendar, because Canada does better in structured processes than in improvisational dominance games. That brings us to the heart of this entire story, the difference between a trade deal and a trade relationship. A trade deal is a document. A trade relationship is trust, expectations, and shared rules. And Canada is now operating as if the relationship is broken, even if the deal still exists. That is why Carney has been explicitly pushing trade diversification, traveling to India, Australia, and Japan as part of a strategy to reduce Canada's reliance on the US market and attract investment in an uncertain world. This isn't a side quest. It is the insurance policy Canada builds when it no longer believes US stability can be assumed. If you want to understand Canada walks away, imagine you're in Ottawa and you're looking at 2 truths at the same time. Truth 1, Canada cannot replace the US market overnight. Truth 2, Canada cannot remain 75% dependent on a market where access is being charged for politically. So Canada's strategy becomes, keep the border economy alive, but build parallel channels so that threats lose power over time. And that strategy has 3 pillars. Pillar 1, maximize USMCA compliance and exemptions. Even in the middle of the trade war, Canada has repeatedly stressed that most trade remains tariff-free under USMCA. Carney has said Canada would match US tariff exemptions under USMCA, easing Canada's own retaliatory posture in order to keep the protected trade lanes as wide as possible. That is not surrender. That is triage. Protect the biggest flow while fighting about the sectors that are still bleeding. Pillar 2. Fight tariffs in ways that raise US domestic political cost. Counter tariffs. Targeted pressure. Strategic procurement choices. In earlier phases of the trade war, Canada imposed retaliatory tariffs, then later removed many to match US exemptions, an indication that Ottawa calibrates pressure rather than simply escalating forever. Pillar 3. Diversify trade and investment relationships, so the US can't hold Canada's entire economy hostage. Again, India, Australia, Japan trips, China sector arrangements, EU defense and industrial partnerships in parallel. Whether you like those choices or not, the logic is consistent. Reduce single point of failure risk. Now let's translate the political language into the concrete. What are the trade deals Canada is walking away from? It's the sector deal fantasy, that Canada can sit down with Trump, do a steel-aluminum carve-out, do an auto carve-out, do a lumber carve-out, and then the storm passes. LeBlanc has acknowledged Canada was close to sectoral tariff relief in the fall before Trump ended talks. Bloomberg reporting also described that Canada probably wouldn't reach a near-term deal to lower sector tariffs and that negotiations would be rolled into the USMCA review. Canada's own messaging and LeBlanc's recent comments are consistent with one thing: if it isn't durable, it isn't worth signing. And this is where Canada walks away becomes a strategic move rather than a tantrum, because walking away is only powerful if you're walking away from something that hurts you. Canada is walking away from the illusion that it can buy stability from Trump with concessions. Canada is choosing a different kind of pain, the pain of uncertainty now, in exchange for the possibility of more sovereignty later. And that trade-off is brutal, because uncertainty is not abstract. Uncertainty means factories postpone expansions, it means companies shift production, it means investors hesitate, it means small exporters who could qualify for USMCA preferences but don't always file paperwork, get caught in the crossfire when the default tariff environment rises. And when LeBlanc says uncertainty may be the objective, he's naming the quiet weapon. You can weaken a country without ever firing a shot by freezing its future. Now, let's talk about Trump's fire back, because this is where competitor scripts usually go full soap opera. I'm going to do something different. I'm going to show you the mechanism of Trump's fire back. The mechanism is not anger. The mechanism is dominance maintenance. In a dominance negotiation, if the other side demonstrates they are willing to endure pain rather than comply, you have to escalate, or you lose the ability to threaten. So Trump's fireback is a predictable sequence. First, punish, then offer a narrow off-ramp, then demand a loyalty signal, then claim victory. You can see this rhythm in multiple episodes: the digital services tax suspension and resumption, the Ontario ad termination, the China deal tariff threat, the 35% tariff threat, and shifting deadlines. Now, if you're Canada, this is the nightmare. Every deal becomes a temporary ceasefire that must be rebought. So Canada is trying to redesign the conflict so that deals, if they happen, are locked into treaty structure and political procedure, not personal mood. That's why the USMCA review matters so much. Because even though the review can be weaponized, it's also the only arena where Canada can force the US to talk in something resembling a rules-based framework. USTR's public comment process is a sign of that institutionalization. Brookings explains the path forward, including how a successful review can shore up confidence and how failure can lead to years of annual reviews and uncertainty. So when Canada walks away, what it's really doing is walking away from the informal, improvisational bargaining model, and that is why Trump hates it, because Trump thrives in the informal model. Now let's zoom in on the cast of characters, because the competitor template you showed me does this very well. It turns policy into motive. Start with Mark Carney. Carney's political brand in this era is technocrat, who refuses humiliation. He signals seriousness, structure, and long-term resilience. He also publicly rejects the idea that Canada lives because of the US, and frames Canada as master in its own home. Whether you agree with his politics or not, his negotiation posture has a theme: Canada will not bargain from a kneeling position. Now Dominic LeBlanc. LeBlanc is the grinder, the person who has to translate political posture into meetings, into documents, into trade law, into real outcomes. And this week, LeBlanc's message was basically, the US might use the annual review structure to keep us in uncertainty. Investment is already chilling. We will control what we can control. The private conversations are not discouraging even if the public argument is loud. That is a very careful message. It says we're not panicking, we're preparing. But it also says, we are not going to pretend this is normal. Now, Doug Ford, Ontario's premier, because Ontario is where the auto sector lives, where manufacturing lives, where the political heat lives, Ford has repeatedly said no deal is better than a bad deal with Trump, and has described this as an economic war. He also praised the US Supreme Court striking down many tariffs Trump imposed using emergency powers law, viewing it as walls closing in and a potential constraint on Trump. That matters because it reveals something. Canadian strategy is not only about negotiating with Trump, it's also about waiting for constraints on Trump. Courts, Congress, midterms, the system. Canada is not just negotiating policy, it's negotiating time. Now on the US side, you have Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Bessent warned Carney not to pick a fight going into USMCA review, framing it as cheap political points versus working for Canadians, and even took a personal swipe at Carney as a technocrat, pivoting to politics. This matters because it shows how the US frames the negotiation. Canada's resistance is treated as political theatre, and the review season is treated as leverage. In other words, stop embarrassing us publicly, and come into the review season compliant. That is the subtext. And you have USTR Jamieson Greer, who becomes the central operator for review season, because USTR is where trade deals become text, timelines, and enforcement. USTR has already been preparing the USMCA joint review process publicly, so the battlefield is moving from Trump's feed to USTR's calendar. That is the structural shift Canada is betting on. Now we get to the red folder moment. If you want to understand why Canada walking away matters, you need to understand one line. If the 2026 USMCA joint review does not result in all parties confirming extension, the agreement doesn't die, but it enters an annual review cycle that can keep North America permanently uncertain until expiry in 2036, unless all parties later confirm extension. That's not a rumor, that's the design. Brookings lays it out, CRS lays it out, USTR has been planning around it. So here is the strategic nightmare scenario for Canada. The US doesn't withdraw from USMCA. The US doesn't end free trade. Instead, the US keeps USMCA alive in a minimal form, enough to keep supply chains dependent, but refuses to extend certainty, forcing annual reviews, extracting concessions year by year. That would be a decade of hostage negotiation, and LeBlanc just warned publicly that this is imaginable if uncertainty is an objective. That is Canada naming the nightmare out loud. Now if you're Trump, why would you want uncertainty? Because uncertainty is leverage you can use without passing a law. Uncertainty makes business plead for relief. Uncertainty makes provinces pressure Ottawa. Uncertainty makes Canadian political coalitions fracture, and fractured coalitions produce concessions. So Canada's response, we will not accept bad deals, we will prepare for the review, we will diversify, is an attempt to immunize itself against that pressure. But immunization has a cost, and that cost is economic pain now. So the question becomes, can Canada endure the uncertainty long enough to make diversification real? That's why Carney's trade-focused trips matter. They are not photo ops. They're part of a strategy to reduce the US share of Canada's export dependency over time. Now let's talk about the most misunderstood fact in this entire trade war. Most Canada-US trade remains tariff-free because of USMCA exemptions. Even amid tariffs and threats, LeBlanc has emphasized that the US maintained an exemption for Canada and Mexico under the deal, because it's in America's economic interest. And Carney has said the average tariff rate on Canadian goods remains the lowest among US trading partners, in part because of USMCA carve-outs. So the economic relationship is not ending, it is becoming bifurcated. A large protected lane, and a set of crucial sectors, steel, aluminum, autos, lumber, where the pain concentrates and politics explode. This bifurcation is why Canada walking away is such a risky move, because Canada can't walk away from the protected lane without harming itself. So Canada's walk away is selective. Walk away from the fantasy of a quick sectoral rescue deal, not from trade itself. Walk away from public negotiations that can be terminated by an ad or a tweet, not from private channels. LeBlanc even said the private government-to-government conversations are not discouraging, while the public political argument is loud. That means Canada is not actually abandoning talks. It is abandoning theatre. Now we need to talk about the Reuters moment, the one that shows how close Canada has come to actually quitting. On August 1st, 2025, after Trump increased tariffs on Canadian goods not covered by USMCA to 35%, Reuters reported that Canada's trade team could quit DC talks, according to a Carney advisor, even as Canadian officials said a deal could still be weeks away. That's the walk-away line in its raw form. Canada considered walking away because the US escalated mid-negotiation, and that moment matters because it shows something essential. Canada's willingness to walk away is not rhetorical. It has been on the table before. But here's the difference between then and now. In 2025, walking away was a tactic, a threat to force better terms. In 2026, walking away is turning into a doctrine. Canada will not accept a deal at any cost, and if tariffs become the permanent baseline, Canada will build a different economic future rather than keep paying tribute. You can see this in the way Canadian officials increasingly frame resilience and diversification as not optional but necessary. It's not that Canada wants the trade war, it's that Canada no longer believes it can end it by pleading. Now, what does Trump do when Canada tries to turn walking away into doctrine? He tests it. He tries to find the weakest joint in Canada's coalition, and there are three joints. Joint 1, autos. If the US threatens auto tariffs, Ontario screams. Joint 2, metals, steel and aluminum. If the US keeps high metals tariffs, industry investment decisions get distorted, and the pain spreads into construction, manufacturing, and downstream jobs. Joint 3, symbolism, Canada's sovereignty and public posture. If Canada publicly humiliates Trump, Trump reacts not just as a president, but as a brand, and that brings us to why the Ontario ad incident was so consequential. It proved Trump will punish symbolic disrespect with economic retaliation. That's why Canada is trying to avoid public negotiating theatre now. Because in this relationship, symbolism triggers tariffs. Now let's do the competitor-style escalation ladder, but real. Step 1. Canada stops chasing sector deals and shifts to the July review. Step 2. Trump frames this as Canada being ungrateful or disloyal and threatens punishment. Step 3. Uncertainty increases. Investment chills. Canadian domestic pressure rises. Step 4. Canada either cracks and signs a bad deal, or doubles down and accelerates diversification. That is the fork in the road. And because this is Dylan Sterling analysis, I'm going to give you the three realistic scenarios between now and July 1st, 2026. Scenario 1. Managed uncertainty. The cold peace. In this scenario, both sides keep most trade flowing under USMCA exemptions, but the sectoral tariffs remain high, and the review season becomes a bargaining arena, where the US pushes for concessions and Canada tries to limit damage. The key feature is, nobody wants to own a full rupture, so they keep the system alive while fighting inside it. This scenario is consistent with LeBlanc's argument that exemptions exist because it's in US economic interest, even as sector tariffs bite. It's also consistent with US TAR's formal preparation process. The review becomes the fight. Scenario 2. The pressure deal trap. A narrow deal that looks like relief, but functions like dependency. In this scenario, Trump offers Canada a sectoral carve-out, metals relief, auto relief, in exchange for something Canada will regret later: procurement concessions, energy concessions, enforcement posture on third countries, or tighter industrial conditions. Canada can be tempted into this because sectors are bleeding, but the risk is that once you accept a deal under threat, you teach Trump the method works, and then you have to buy relief again. Canada's move away from theatre is designed to avoid this trap, but politics can pull Canada back in if the pain becomes concentrated enough. Scenario 3. Annual review hostage decade. The worst-case slow-motion collapse of confidence. This is the scenario LeBlanc hinted at. No consensus at the review. USMCA continues, but without extension. Annual reviews begin. Every year becomes a political cliff. Businesses stop investing because they can't model risk. Canada accelerates diversification, But diversification takes time. The result is a decade of low confidence, low investment, and high political friction, not because the agreement ends, because certainty ends. Brookings describes exactly how annual reviews can follow if the parties do not extend at the first review. LeBlanc described exactly how that uncertainty could be an objective. That's the nightmare. A living agreement with a dead future. Now the big question, is Canada strong enough to walk away? The answer depends on what walk away means. If it means walking away from the US market entirely, no, that's not realistic in the short term. If it means walking away from bad deals, and walking away from theatre while using USMCA compliance to protect the largest flows, yes, Canada can attempt that. And that is exactly what Canada appears to be doing: protect what is protected, fight what is contested, and build what is missing. Because the real vulnerability for Canada is not trade itself, it's concentrated dependence plus political unpredictability. And once a country accepts that reality, it has only two choices: submit and hope the bully becomes kinder, or diversify and accept pain. Canada is choosing diversification, and that is why this moment feels like a rupture. Not because Canada signed a dramatic declaration, but because Canada stopped pretending the old relationship is coming back. LeBlanc said Canada can't control everything, so it will control what it can control. Carney is traveling to build non-US trade lanes, and Canada is preparing for July as the real battle. That is what walking away looks like in 2026. Not rage quitting, but redesigning the game board so threats lose power over time. So here is the question I want you to answer in the comments. If you were Canada, would you take a good enough deal with Trump that locks in some permanent tariffs, but buys stability for a few sectors? Or would you walk away from that deal, accept the uncertainty, and bet that building resilience and diversification is worth the pain? Because that's the real choice hiding under the headline. Not Canada versus America. Not Carney versus Trump. It's stability purchased with concessions versus sovereignty purchased with time. This is Dylan Sterling Analysis. I'm Dylan Sterling, and I'll see you in the next one.